Chapter 30. Letter to Judge Austin A. King. Richmond Prison, May 13th, 1839. Honorable Sir, having been confined in prison nearly 7 months, and the time having arrived when a change of venue can be taken in order for the further prosecution of our trials, and the time when I can speak my mind freely without endangering the lives or liberties of any but myself, I now take the liberty of seriously objecting to a trial anywhere within the bounds of this state, and of earnestly praying to your honor and to all the authorities, civil and military, that my case may come within the law of banishment enacted by Governor Boggs, and so vigorously enforced upon from 10 to 15,000 of our society, including my wife and little ones, together with all my witnesses and friends. My reasons are obvious and founded upon notorious facts that are known to you, sir, and to the people in general of this republic, and therefore need no proof. Some of them are as follows. First, I have never received any protection by law, either of my person, property, or family, while residing in this state, to which I first immigrated in 1831. Second, I was driven by force of arms from Jackson County, wounded and bleeding, in 1833, while my house was burned, my crops and provisions robbed from me and destroyed, and my land and improvements kept from me until now, while my family was driven out without shelter at the approach of winter. Third, these crimes still go unpunished, notwithstanding I made oath before the Honorable Judge Ryland, then acting district judge, to the foregoing outrages, and afterward replied in person to His Excellency Dallin Dunklin, then governor of the state, for redress and protection of myself and friends, and the restoration of more than 1,000 of our fellow citizens to our homes. Fourth, my wife and children have now been driven from our house and improvements in Caldwell County and banished from the state on pain of death, together with about 10,000 of our society, including all my friends and witnesses, and this by the express order of His Excellency Lilburn W. Boggs, Governor of the State of Missouri, and by the vigorous execution of this order by General Lucas and Clark, and followed up by murders, rapes, plunders, thefts, and robberies of the most inhumane character by a lawless mob who had, from time to time, for more than 5 years past, trampled upon all law and authority and upon all the rights of man. Fifth, all these inhuman outrages and crimes go unpunished and are unnoticed by you, sir, and by all the authorities of the state. Nay, rather, you are one of the very actors. You yourself threatened in open court the extermination of the Mormons if they should ever be again guilty of cultivating their lands. Sixth, the legislature of the state has approved of and sanctioned this act of banishment, with all the crimes connected therewith, by voting an appropriation of $200,000 for the payment of troops engaged in this awful, unconstitutional, and treasonable enterprise. In monarchical governments, the banishment of criminals after their legal trial and condemnation has been frequently resorted to, but the banishment of innocent women and children from house and home and country to wander in a strange land unprotected and unprovided for, while their husbands and fathers are retained in dungeons, is an act unknown in the annals of history, except in this single instance in the 19th century, when it has actually transpired in a republican state, where the Constitution guarantees to every man the protection of life, liberty, and property, and the right of trial by jury. These, sir, are outrages which would put monarchy to blush, and from which the most despotic tyrants of the Dark Ages would turn away with shame and disgust. In these proceedings, sir, Missouri has enrolled her name on the list of immortal fame. Her transactions will be handed down the stream of time to the latest posterity, who will read with wonder and astonishment the history of proceedings which are without a parallel in the annals of time. Why should the authorities of the state strain at a gnat and swallow a camel? Why be so strictly legal as to compel me to pass through all the forms of a slow and pretended legal prosecution previous to my enlargement, out of a pretense of respect to the laws of the state, which have been openly trampled upon and disregarded toward us from first to last? Why not include me in the general wholesale banishment of our society, that I may support my family, which is now reduced to beggary in a land of strangers? But, sir, when the authorities of the state shall redress all these wrongs, shall punish the guilty according to law, and shall restore my family and friends to all our rights, and shall pay all the damages which we as a people have sustained, then I shall believe them sincere in their professed zeal for law and justice. Then shall I be convinced that I can have a fair trial in the state. But until then, I hereby solemnly protest against being tried in this state with the full and conscientious conviction that I have not just grounds to expect a fair and impartial trial. I therefore most sincerely pray your honor and all the authorities in the state to either banish me without further persecution, or I freely consent to a trial before the judiciary of the United States. With sentiments and consideration and due respect, I have the honor to subscribe myself. Your prisoner, Parley P. Pratt. Chapter 31. The 4 following chapters are extracted from the Millennial Star, published in Liverpool, England, Volume 8, 9, 10, and 11. I give them in full, with some little revision, although they contain a repetition of some of the things recorded in the foregoing chapters. At the end of this extraordinary mock trial of Inquisition, which lasted over 2 weeks, I was unchained from Joseph and Hiram Smith and others, and being separated from them, was conducted to a gloomy, dark, cold, and filthy dungeon in Richmond Ray County, where I was doomed to spend the winter and spring and await a further trial, while they shared a similar fate in a place called Liberty in Clay County. When I first entered the dungeon, there were some 20 men, mostly heads of families, who had been torn from their families in those awful times and thrust into prison. It was not only crowded and suffocating, without a chair, stool, bench, bed, furniture, or window light, but just then completely filled with smoke by a fire which was lighted in a stove, without a pipe or any conductor for the smoke to pass out, except at the crevices between the timbers, where the winter storm was passing in. When my guard conducted me to the door of this miserable cell, it grated on its huge hinges and opened like the pit yawning to receive me. A volume of thick smoke issued forth and seemed to forbid my entrance, but urged in my rear by bayonet and loaded pistols in the hands of savage beings, I endeavored to enter, but was forced to retreat again outside the door to breathe a moment the fresh air. At this instant, several pistols were cocked and presented at my head and breast, with terrible threats and oaths of instant death if I did not go in again. I told them to fire as soon as they pleased, for I must breathe a moment or die in the attempt. After standing a few moments, I again entered the prison and threw myself down, my face to the floor, to avoid the smoke. Here I remained for some time, partly in a state of insensibility. My heart sickened within me, and a death-like feeling came over me, from which I did not wholly recover for several days. I arose, however, as soon as I was able, and began to speak to and recognize my fellow prisoners. Most of them were my neighbors and acquaintances. The door was now locked, bolted, and barred, and several guards placed before it. The fire died away, and the smoke gradually cleared away from the dungeon, but the floor formed a hard and cold winter lodging. In a few days, all those in our prison, except 5, were released on bail, and themselves and bail banished from the state with the rest of the society, thus compelling them to forfeit their bail bonds, which amounted in all to many $1,000s. The 5 who remained were Morris Phelps, Darwin Chase, Norman Shearer, Luman Gibbs, and myself. 2 or 3 were finally dismissed, being boys scarcely out of their teens, but another was soon added, by the name of King Fellet. This made our final number 4. One of this number, namely Luman Gibbs, denied the faith and turned a traitor to the others, becoming their most inveterate enemy. This was in order to save his life and gain his liberty. However, he was still kept in prison as a spy upon us, lest it should be said that it was wholly a religious persecution. But he was treated very well, and went out to dine with the sheriff or others, or to spend a day with his wife whenever it pleased him to do so. Our food was the most unwholesome kind, and scant at that, consisting of bones and remnants of meat, coarse cornbread, and sometimes a little coffee. We generally partook of our meals in a standing position, using our fingers instead of knives, forks, or plates. A tin cup served us for our coffee. We were guarded very strictly, both by night and day, by 2 or 3 men with loaded pistols. These consisted of the most unprincipled, profligate villains that could be found anywhere. They would swear, drink, gamble, and sing the most obscene and disgusting songs. They would boast of shooting the Mormons, robbing and plundering them, committing rapes. They would also insult every female slave or black woman who might happen to come within hearing, and then boast of their criminal connections with them. The blasphemy, the noisy gambling, the blackguard chit-chat, doleful lullaby, and vulgar songs of these guards, grating daily upon our ears, seemed like the howl and wailing of the damned, or like wandering spirits and demons hovering around to torment us. What greatly added to our affliction, as if to complete our hell, the old apostate Gibbs became very quarrelsome and noisy, not only to us, but with his wife also, who sometimes came into the prison to spend a few days with him. He was a hard-faced, ill-formed man of about 50 years of age, full of jealousy, extremely selfish, very weak-minded, and withal a little love cracked. And I may say that he seemed not to possess one redeeming quality. His wife was about the same age, and withal a coarse, tall, masculine-looking woman, and one of whom he had no reason to complain or be jealous. True, she did not love him, for no female could possibly do that. But then no one else would love her, nor was she disposed to court their affections. However, he was jealous of her and therefore abused her, and this kept a constant and noisy strife and wrangling between them whenever she was present. Whole nights were spent in this way, during which no one in or about the prison slept. After a quarrel of some 2 or 3 days and nights between them, he would attempt to regain her love, and a conversation like the following would ensue. Lumen, drawing down his face and drolling his words with a loud and doleful tone, commenced as follows. Now, Phila, won't you love me? Come, here's my watch, and here's all the money I've got. Then, turning to us, he would exclaim, Boys, I'll tell you all about it. The fact is, she never did love me. She only married me out of pity, we being members of the Baptist Church together in Vermont. Then again, addressing his wife, Come now, Phila, won't you love me? Oh, that I had been born a rich man. I would give you $1 a minute to love me. Phila would then laugh and call him a silly old fool, whereupon he would turn away in a rage and exclaim, Go along away. Nobody wants your love. No how. On one occasion, they had quarreled and kept us awake all night, and just at break of day we heard a noise like a scuffle and a slamming against the wall. Next followed a woman's voice, half in laugh and half in exultation. Tee-hee-hee-hee-hee, Lumen. What's the matter? What's the matter, Lumen? Then a pause, and afterward a man's voice in a glum, sorry, and rather a whining tone was heard at a distance from the bed, exclaiming, Now, I swan, Phila, that's too bad. The truth of the matter was this. She had braced her back against the wall, and with both her feet placed against his body, had kicked him out of bed and landed him on the opposite side of the room. Such scenes as these and all the folly of the guards served to enhance the misery of imprisonment and to render our sufferings complete. We tried to keep them quiet, but tried in vain. Neither threats, nor persuasion, coaxing, nor reasoning had any influence over them. This miserable specimen of humanity was a peculiar favorite of the sheriff and guards and other citizens of Richmond. He was considered by them as the only honest, good, deserving man in the prison. They often expressed pity for him and wished he was at liberty. He, in turn, watched our movements closely and was ready to betray us on the least show on our part of any meditated plan of escape. Under these painful circumstances, we spent a long and dreary winter. Our whole community, who were not in prison, were forced out of the state, with the loss of homes, property, and many lives. They fled by thousands to Illinois. My wife visited me several times in prison, but at length the period expired that the state authorities had stipulated for every Mormon to be gone, and my wife and children and a few others who remained behind were obliged to fly or be exterminated, as bands of armed men were roaming amid the deserted settlement, robbing, plundering, destroying property, and threatening all who remained. My fellow prisoners, who had been separated from me and sent to the prison at Liberty, had also effected their escape. And had fled to Illinois to join their families. In short, all were gone except King Follett, Morris Phelps, and myself, and the old apostate who was left to torment us. Alone in a state which was wholly governed by an open bandit of murderers and robbers, we seemed abandoned to our fate and doomed to suffer that full weight of vengeance and fury which seemed in reserve for an entire people. But that people was now beyond their reach. All the fury of the storm, therefore, seemed now to beat upon our heads. We were daily threatened with assassination without the form of a trial, and were repeatedly told that we never should escape alive from the state. Our guards were doubly vigilant, while the sheriff took every possible precaution. Lumen, the apostate, was also in constant watchfulness and busy in forming plans. Lumen, the apostate, was also in constant watchfulness and busy in forming plans for escape, then accusing us and pretending to reveal wonderful things to our keepers in regard to our plans, which, in fact, only existed in his lying brain. This increased the severity of our confinement and seemed to preclude the possibility of escape. To be tried without friends or witnesses, or even with them, by a set of Gadianton robbers and murderers who could drive out and murder women and children, was but to be condemned to execution, to tarry there and drag out a miserable life, while our wives and children wandered abroad in a land of strangers without the protection of husbands and fathers, was worse than to die 10,000 deaths. Under these circumstances, and halfway between hope and despair, I spent several days in fasting and prayer, during which one deep and all-absorbing inquiry, one only thought, seemed to hold possession of my mind. It seemed to me that if there was a God in heaven who ever spoke to man on earth, I would know from him the truth of this one question. It was not how long shall I suffer, it was not when or by what means I should be delivered, but it was simply this: shall I ever, at any time, however distant it may be, or whatever I may suffer first, shall I ever be free again in this life and enjoy the society of my dear wife and children, and walk abroad at liberty, dwell in society, and preach the gospel as I have done in bygone years? Let me be sure of this, and I care not what I suffer. To circumnavigate the globe, to travel the deserts of Arabia, to wander amid the wild scenes of the Rocky Mountains, to accomplish so desirable an object, would seem like a mere trifle if I could only be sure at last, after some days of prayer and fasting and seeking the Lord on the subject, I retired to my bed in my lonely chamber at an early hour, and while the other prisoners and guards were chatting and beguiling the lonesome hours in the upper apartment of the prison, I lay in silence, seeking and expecting an answer to my prayer, when suddenly I seemed carried away in the spirit and no longer sensible to outward objects with which I was surrounded. A haven of peace and calmness pervaded my bosom. A personage from the world of spirits stood before me with a smile of compassion in every look, and pity mingled with the tenderest love and sympathy in every expression of the countenance. A soft hand seemed placed within my own, and a glowing cheek was laid in tenderness and warmth upon mine. A well-known voice saluted me, which I readily recognized as that of my wife, as the wife of my youth, who had for nearly 2 years been sweetly sleeping where the wicked cease from troubling and the weary are at rest. I was made to realize that she was sent to commune with me and to answer my question. Knowing this, I said to her in a most earnest and inquiring tone, "Shall I ever be at liberty again in this life to enjoy the society of my family and the saints, and preach the gospel as I have done?" She answered definitely and unhesitatingly, "Yes." I then recollected that I had agreed to be satisfied with the knowledge of that one fact, but now I wanted more. Said I, "Can you tell me how or by what means, or when I shall escape. She replied, "That thing is not made known to myself yet." That thing is not made known to me yet. I instantly felt that I had gone beyond my agreement and my faith in asking this question, and that I must be contented at present with the answer to the first. Her gentle spirit then saluted me and withdrew. I came to myself. The doleful noise of the guards and wrangling and angry words of the old apostate again grated on my ears, but heaven and hope were in my soul. Next morning I related the whole circumstance of my vision to my 2 fellow prisoners, who rejoiced exceedingly. This may seem to some like an ideal dream or a romance of the imagination, but to me it was and always will be a reality, both as it regards to what I then experienced and the fulfillment afterward. In order to show some pretense of respect for some of the forms of law, Judge Austin A. King now entered our prison and took our testimony, preparatory to a change of venue. I shall never forget this interview. There stood our judge face to face with those who, by his cruelty and injustice, had lived a cold half-year in a dungeon. He refused to look us in the eye, hung his head, and looked like a culprit before his betters, about to receive his doom. The looks of guilt and misery portrayed in his countenance during that brief interview bespoke more of misery than we had suffered during our confinement. I actually pitied him in my heart. With an extraordinary effort and a voice scarcely audible, he administered the oath and withdrew. By means of this change, we were finally to be removed 100 miles down the country and confined in the prison at Columbia, Boone County, to await a final trial. A long, dreary winter and spring had now passed away, and the time drew near for our removal. We looked forward to the change with some degree of hope and expectation, for it could not be for the worse, and might perhaps be for the better. At any rate, the journey would give us a chance to leave our dark and loathsome dungeon and look upon the light of day, the beauties of nature, and to breathe the untainted air. The morning of the departure at length arrived. Mr. Brown, the sheriff, entered our prison with a fierce and savage look, and bidding us hold out our hands, coupled us together in pairs with irons locked on our wrists, and marched us out, and amid a throng of people placed us in a carriage, accompanied with 4 other guards on horseback with loaded pistols. We bade farewell to Richmond. On horseback with loaded pistols, accompanied with 4 other guards on horseback with loaded pistols, we bade farewell to Richmond. It was a pleasant morning in early summer, when all the freshness and beauty of spring seemed blended in rich profusion, with the productions peculiar to the season as it advances towards maturity. The leaves of the trees were full grown. The forest presented a freshness of beauty and loveliness that reminded me of paradise. The plains were covered with a coat of green, and the wild flowers of the prairie blooming in all their variety, sent forth a perfume that mingled with every zephyr and wafted sweet odor on every breeze. The prisoners who had breathed only a tainted air for half a year, the very ground itself seemed to send forth sweetness, which was plainly perceptible to the senses. We enjoyed our ride through that delightful country more than any being who had never been confined for weary months. We enjoyed our ride through that delightful country more than any being could more than any being could who had never been confined for weary months in a dreary dungeon. The day at length closed, and we were taken into a house and stretched upon our backs on the floor, all fastened together with wrists and ankle irons in such a manner that we could not turn nor change our position. The doors and windows were then made fast, and the sentinels on duty guarded us by turns until morning. This was our night's rest after 40 miles travel. The next day proved extremely rainy with heavy thunder, but still we traveled. In the course of the day we came to a stream that was swollen by the rains to that degree that we had to swim over it and stem a swift current. This hindered us. The next day proved extremely rainy with heavy thunder, but still we traveled. In the course of a day we came to a stream that was swollen by the rains to that degree that we had to swim over it and stem a swift current. This hindered us for some hours in crossing over with horses, wagons, baggage, etiquette, and as all of us were engaged in this business, our chains were taken off for the time. When we had crossed over, put on our clothes, and placed the baggage, saddles, arms, etiquette ready for a start, it was night, and we were very weary and hungry, having had no refreshments during the day. The rain was also pouring in torrents, and the night settling in extremely dark. 4 miles of wild country, partly covered with forests and underwoods, still lay between us and the nearest house. Through the hurry of the moment, or for some other reason, they neglected to replace our irons, and our limbs were free. The carriage drove through a thick forest during the extreme darkness, and was several times on the eve of upsetting. This caused us to assume a position for saving ourselves by rising upon our feet, ready to jump out in case the carriage upsetting. The sheriff and guards, seeing this, rode close on each side, and cocking their pistols, swore they would shoot us dead if we attempted to leave the carriage, and that if it upset, they would shoot us anyhow, for fear we might attempt to escape. After 2 days more of rain, hail, and travel, we arrived at Columbia, where we were immediately thrust into a gloomy dungeon filled with darkness, filth, and cobwebs. The naked floor was our lodging. We had traveled hard through rain and fatigue for several days, and on the last day had ridden till sundown without refreshment. We were extremely hungry and weary, but received no refreshment, not even a drink of water, till late in the evening, when our new keeper, Mr. John Scott, visited us with some buttermilk and bread. But we were now too much exhausted and too low spirited to eat. We thanked him for his kindness and sank down exhausted on the floor, where we rested as well as we could till morning. We saw no more of Sheriff Brown on his guard, and will now take final leave of them. We saw no more of Sheriff Brown or his guard, and will now take final leave of them, merely observing that they made it a point to insult every black woman they met on the way, frequently turning aside with them into the woods and fields. On returning to the company, they would boast and glory in their criminal intercourse with them. After spending one night in our new dungeon, we were called on by the sheriff to come up into a more comfortable apartment, and were treated with some degree of humanity. We were no longer troubled with guards, and even Lumen and Filma behaved much better. We had been in our new situation something like a month, when we were visited by some friends from Illinois, from whom we learned the fate of our families and friends. The wife of Mr. Phelps rode 160 miles on horseback, accompanied by her brother, a young man named Clark. They arrived in Columbia and paid us a visit in prison about the 1st of July. My brother Orson also arrived on horseback about the same time. With these friends, we had a good visit for some days, they being permitted to stay in the prison with us. They also brought a letter from my wife, by which I learned that she made her escape from far west to Quincy, Illinois, with her children and some of her goods, by the aid of Mr. Davis Rogers of New York. During this journey, they were much exposed to hardships and trouble, having to camp by the way in company with other women and children who were in a like condition. On crossing a swollen stream, Mrs. Pratt had left the carriage to cross on a footbridge, leaving the children to ride through it. She had just crossed over and turned to look back to see whether the carriage came through in safety when she discovered a little girl's bonnet floating down the stream. And on examination, as the carriage rose the bank, her daughter, a girl of 6 years old, was missing from the carriage. The next moment she saw her floating down the swift current. She gave the alarm to Mr. Rogers, the driver, who instantly dropped the reins and sprang after her into the stream. At this instant, the horses, being high-spirited and active, began to run, and would probably have dashed themselves and carriage goods and the other children to pieces, but for the timely interference of a large prong of a tree, which caught the carriage with such a strong hold that all was brought to a stand. In the meantime, Mr. Rogers succeeded in rescuing the child and bringing her safely to shore. She had, as she stated, pitched head foremost out of the carriage into the water. One of the wheels ran over her and crushed her fast into the mud at the bottom of the stream, but as it rolled over, she caught the spokes with her hands, and by this means the same weight that crushed her down brought her to the surface and saved her life. On examination, the marks of the wheel were distinctly seen on both her thighs, which were seriously injured and nearly broken. After a wearisome journey and various toils and dangers, they at length arrived at Quincy, Illinois, where Mrs. Pratt rented a small house, and by the sale of a few books, with the use of her 2 cows, which some of the brethren had brought from Missouri for her, she was making shift to live from day to day. She still expressed some faint hopes of seeing her husband again in a land of liberty, although at present there was little ground to hope, and she was sometimes nearly in despair. Such was the news brought to us by the arrival of our friends in the prison at Columbia on the 1st of July, 1839, after 8 months of weary confinement. Previous to their arrival, the Lord had shown me in a vision of the night the manner and means of escape, and like Pharaoh's dream, the thing had been doubled. That is shown to, the thing had been doubled. That is shown to me on 2 occasions in the same manner. Mrs. Phelps had the same thing shown to her in a vision previous to her arrival. My brother, Orson Pratt, also came to us with a firm impression that we were about to be delivered. He even predicted that we would go to Illinois when he should return there. As we sat pondering upon these things and comparing our visions and manifestations of the Spirit on this subject, my brother Orson opened the Book of Mormon, when the first sentence that caught his eye was the words of Ammon to King Lamoni, Behold, my brother and my brethren are in prison in the land of Madoni, and I go to deliver them. This was indeed a similar instance to ours. Ammon, on that occasion, had an own brother in prison, and also brethren in the ministry, and did deliver them. Our case was exactly similar, not in Madoni, but in Missouri, and what was still stranger, in a book of 600 pages, this was the only sentence which would have fitted our case. He now began in earnest to make arrangements for our escape. If there had been no strong bolt and bars to overcome, still there was one serious obstacle, which a miracle alone could immediately remove, which was this. I was then very sick and scarcely able to stand on my feet, or to go up and down from the upper room, where we were in the daytime, and the dungeon where we slept. It was the 2nd of July, and our friends could only make an excuse for staying to spend the great national holiday with us, the 4th, before they must leave or excite the suspicions and ill will of the people. And as that day had been a lucky one for our fathers and our nation, we had determined on that time as the proper one to bid farewell to bondage and gain our liberty. In short, we had determined to make that notable day a jubilee to us, or perish in the attempt. We therefore prayed earnest to the Lord that if he had determined to favor our plan, he would heal and strengthen me and give us all courage to act well our part. Through the ministration of the ordinance appointed for healing, I was instantly healed, and from that moment began to feel as strong and fearless as a lion. Our plan was this. My brother Orson Pratt was to wait on the judge and attorney and obtain various papers and arrangements for summoning witnesses from Illinois to attend our trial, which had just been adjourned for some months to come. He was also to procure an order from the court to take affidavits to Illinois in case the witnesses should object to coming to the state from which they had been banished in order to attend the trial. These active preparations on our part to defend our case, together with engaging a lawyer or two and paying a part of their fees beforehand, served as a sufficient blindfold to cover our real intentions. This done, the papers all prepared in the hands of my brother, he and Mrs. Phelps and her brother were to stay with us until the 4th, and after celebrating the day with a dinner in the prison, which we obtained leave to do, he and the young clerk were to take leave with their horses, and also with the horse and saddle on which Mrs. Phelps had ridden, on pretense of taking him home with them to Illinois, while she stayed with her husband a few weeks in the prison, in the meantime engaging her board in the family of the keeper, who occupied part of the building in connection with the prison. This measure on the part of Mrs. Phelps served the double purpose of lulling them into serenity, and also of furnishing a 3rd horse, as there were 3 of us. These 3 horses were to be stationed in a thick of forest about half a mile from the prison, and there the 2 friends were to await in readiness for us to mount, should we be so fortunate as to reach the thicket alive. Sundown on the evening of the 4th was the moment agreed upon, and if we did not then appear, then they were to give us up for lost, and make the best of their way to Illinois, and inform our friends that we had gone to Paradise in attempting to come to them. The reason for appointing this hour was this: our door would be opened at sundown to hand in our supper, and we must then make attempts as our only chance for it was customary to lock us up in the lower dungeon as soon as the shades of evening began to appear. This plan, all matured and arrangements completed with the court and the lawyers, the 4th of July dawned upon us with hope and expectation, while the town and nation were alive with the bustle of preparations for the celebration of the American Jubilee, and while guns were fired and music sounding without, our prison presented a scene of scarcely less life and cheerfulness, for we were also preparing to do proper honors to the day. We had prevailed on the keeper to furnish us with a long pole on which to suspend a flag, and also some red strips of cloth. We then tore a shirt in pieces and took the body of it for the groundwork of a flag, forming with the red stripes of cloth an eagle and the word liberty in large letters. This rude flag of red and white was suspended on the pole from the prison window directly in front of the public square and courthouse, and composed one of the greatest attractions of the day. Hundreds of the people from the county, as well as villagers who were there at the celebration, would come up and stare at the flag, and reading the motto would go swearing and laughing away, exclaiming, "Liberty, liberty, what have liberty, liberty? What have Mormons to do with celebrating liberty in an old prison?" In the meantime, active preparations were in progress for our public dinner, and with the contributions of our friends who were to partake with us, and a portion served from the public table of the citizens of the town, we had a plentiful supply, and as we considered it was to be a day of release, we partook of our feast with much cheer and with thankful as well as social feelings, which I think have been seldom, if ever, suppressed. O ye sons of Columbia, at home and abroad, think back to the 4th of July, 1839, call to your mind your feast in honor of national freedom, and ask yourselves the question, whether in all your pomp and show of joy and social glee you felt anything compared with the feelings of the interest excited during that feast. 8 months and 4 days we had been deprived of the sweets of that liberty which a whole nation was then engaged in celebrating, and we felt that now's the day, now's the hour, to trample on a tyrant's power, to burst at once the prison's gloom, or find a martyr's hero's tomb. The dinner over, our brethren took a final leave of us and our prison, loaded with love, respects, compliments, and messages to our families and friends in Illinois. All these, together with the goodbyes and farewells, were heard and witnessed by the keeper's family, and served the purpose for which they were intended, namely to lull them into security and to remove all possible ground of suspicion as to our intentions. After riding out of town a mile or two in the forest on the road toward Illinois, they turned off into the thick-leaved wilderness, and made their way in secret as best they could to the thicket agreed upon, within about a half a mile of the prison, where, with horses saddled and bridled reins in hand, they waited in anxious suspense the slow progress of the setting sun. Chapter 32. The prison at Columbia was situated in the same square with the courthouse, being on the north edge of the town. Between it and the wilderness, where our friends held the horses in waiting, there were several fields and fences, say for the distance of half a mile, consisting of meadow and pasture land, and all in full view of the town. The prison consisted of a blockhouse, 2 stories high, with 2 rooms below and 2 above. The keeper and his family occupied one end, and the other was used as the prison, the only entrance being through the lower room of the dwelling part, which was occupied by the family, and then up a steep flight of stairs, at the head of which was a heavy oaken door, ironed, locked, and bolted as if to secure a Bonaparte or a Samson. On the inside of this was still another door, which was but slender, with a square hole near the top, of sufficient size to hand in the food and dishes of the prisoners. The large heavy door had always to be opened when food, drink, or other articles were handed in, and while open, the inner door served as a temporary guard to prevent prisoners from escaping, and was not always opened on such occasions, the food being handed through the hole in the top of the door, while the door itself remained locked. However, as a fortunate circumstance for us, the coffee pot, when filled, was not easily slipped through the hole in the door, and rather than spill the coffee and burn his fingers, the keeper would sometimes unlock and open the inner door in order to set in this huge and obstinate pot. And once in, the door would immediately close and the key be turned, while the outer door would perhaps stand open till the supper was finished and the dishes handed out. Now, our whole chance of escape depended on the question whether the inner door would be opened that evening or the coffee pot squeezed in at the hole in the top. Mr. Phelps and Mr. Gibbs were in the upper room of the keeper's apartment near the head of the stairs, with only a log or lumber partition between us and them, and several open crevices in the same, so that we could easily communicate with them. One of them was waiting the issue of the great scene about to be enacted with almost breathless interest and feverish anxiety, as on the good or ill success of that moment depended her future hopes through life, while the other was totally ignorant of the whole affair. In a far corner of our prison sat Lumen, the old apostate, entirely ignorant of the whole plan, and with no other anxiety than a slight wish for the sun to go down, that he might enjoy his supper and the society of his dear Phila in his curtained bed in the upper room, while we were locked in the dungeon below to sleep on an oak floor amid cobwebs and filth. The citizens of the town were now, some of them, gathering in small groups outside of their doors to enjoy the quiet of a summer evening, to smoke a cigar or chat over the merits of the celebration, while others were on horseback to enjoy the evening's ride or to return to their homes. Bands of music, or rather an occasional beat of the drum or blast of the bugle, were still to be heard in the distance, while a few soldiers, or rather militia in uniform, were hurrying to and fro. Groups of boys were playing about the square, and last, though not least, our flag was still on high, with liberty and the eagle in bold colors waving in the night breeze. This had so attracted the attention of the little fellows that once and again they begged of us to make them a present of it, but we told them that we could not spare it till the next morning. The fact is, we were not willing to surrender our castle before the time, or till we made good our retreat. As the sun began to decline behind the long range of forest that bounded the westward horizon, and the lengthened shadows of the tall trees were thrown over our prison, we called upon the Lord to prosper us and open our way, and then sang aloud the following lines. Lord, cause their foolish plans to fail, and let them faint or die. Our souls would quit this poor old jail and fly to Illinois, to join with the embodied saints who are with freedom blessed, that only bliss for which we paint, with them a while to rest. Give joy for grief, give ease for pain, take all our foes away. But let us find our friends again in this eventful day. These lines were sung several times over, with the spirit and with the understanding also, and very loud and distinct, being heard by the old apostate and his wife and by the keepers of the prison. But the doctrine of spiritualizing had become so prevalent that neither this nor the flag of liberty nor any other scripture seemed to them to have any literal meaning, till they found too late the true interpretation by the fulfillment. The sun was now setting. The footsteps of the old keeper were heard on the stairs. The key turned. The outer door grated on its huge hinges, while at the same moment we sprung upon our feet, hats and coats on, rather an unusual dress for a hot day in July, for by the by, my hat proved to be a fur cap, which I wore when first taken in November previous, and stood by the door to act the part of waiters in receiving the dishes and food for supper and placing them on the table. Dish after dish was handed through the small aperture in the door, and duly received and placed upon the table by us, with as much grace and as calm countenances as we thought of nothing else but our suppers. And I will now venture to say that famishing men never watched the movements of a coffee pot with more anxiety than we did on this occasion. At length, the other dishes all being handed in, the huge pot made its appearance in the hole in the top of the door. But one of us cried out to the keeper, Colonel, you will only spill the coffee by attempting to put it through. Besides, it burns our fingers. It will be more convenient to unlock and hand it in at the door. With this it was lowered again, and the key turned on the inner door. In this, as in most other fields of battle, where liberty and life depend on the issue, everyone understood the part assigned to him and exactly fulfilled it. Mr. Follett was to give the door a sudden pull and fling it wide open the moment the key was turned. Mr. Phelps, being well skilled in wrestling, was to press out foremost and come in contact with the jailer. I was to follow in the center, and Mr. Follett, who held the door, was to bring up the rear, while Sister Phelps was to pray. No sooner was the key turned than the door was seized by Mr. Follett with both hands, and with his foot placed against the wall, he soon opened a passage, which was in the same instant filled by Mr. Phelps and followed by myself and Mr. Follett. Mr. Phelps and followed by myself and Mr. Follett. The old jailer strode across the way and stretched out his arms like Bunyan's Apollyon, or like a giant despair in Doubting Castle, or like a giant despair in Doubting Castle, but all to no purpose. 1 or 2 leaps brought us to the bottom of the stairs, carrying the old gentleman with us, headlong, helter-skelter, while old Lumen sat and laughed in his corner of the prison, and Mrs. Phelps exclaimed, O Lord God of Israel, thou canst help. Old Mrs. Gibbs looked on in silent amazement. while the jailer's wife acted the part of the giant Despair's wife, Diffidence, and not only assisted in the scuffle, but cried out so loud that the town was soon alarmed. In the meantime, we found ourselves in the open air in front of the prison, and in full view of the citizens, who had already commenced to rally, while Mr. Phelps and the jailer still clenched fast hold of each other like two mastiffs. However, in another instant, he cleared himself, and we were all three scampering off through the fields toward the thicket. By this time, the town was all in motion. The quietness of the evening was suddenly changed into noise and bustle, and it was soon evident that the thrilling scenes of the great drama of the 4th of July and of the Columbian celebration of liberty were yet to be enacted. The streets on both sides of the fields we were running were soon thronged with soldiers in uniform, mounted riflemen, footmen with fence stakes, clubs, or with whatever came to hand, and with boys, dogs, etiquette, all running, rushing, screaming, swearing, shouting, bawling, and looking with clouds of looking while clouds of dust rose behind them. The cattle also partook of the general panic and ran bellowing away, as if to hide from the scene. The fields behind us also presented a similar scene. Fences were leaped or broken down with a crash. Men, boys, and horses came tumbling over hedge and ditch, rushing with the fury of a whirlwind in the chase. But we kept our course for the thicket, our toes barely touching the ground, while we seemed to leap with the fleetness of a deer, or as the young hart upon the mountains. Our friends who had stood waiting in the thicket had watched the last rays of the sun as they faded away, and had observed the quiet stillness of the evening as it began to steal over the distant village where we were confined, and had listened with almost breathless anxiety for the first sound which was to set all things in commotion, and which would say to them in language not to be understood that the struggle had commenced. For some moments after the last golden beam had disappeared, they listened in vain. The occasional lowing of a cow as she came home from the woodland pasture, impatient for her calf, and the milkmaid to ease her of her rich burden. The mingled sound of human voices in the distance in common conversation, the merry laugh of the young beaux and their sweethearts, the quiet song of the whippoorwill mingled with the merry notes of the violin, the thrill of the bugle, or the soft and plaintive notes of the flute, stole upon the silence of the evening and were occasionally interrupted by the clatter of hoofs, as a few of the citizens were retiring from the enjoyment of a public day to their own peaceful homes in the country. These and other beatings of their anxiety and almost bursting hearts were the only sounds which fell upon their ears, till suddenly they heard a rumbling and confused noise, as of footsteps rushing down the stairs of a prison. Then a shrill cry of alarm from Mrs. Diffidence, the giantess, and soon followed by the shouts and rush of men, dogs, horses, and prisoners towards the spot where they were located. They then sprang forward to the edge of the fields and ran back again to the horses, and again returned, as if the using of their own limbs would serve to add nimbleness to those of the prisoners, and to quicken their speed. As soon as the prisoners drew near, they were hailed by their friends and conducted to the horses. They were breathless and nearly ready to faint, but in a moment they were assisted to mount, and a whip and the reins placed in their hands, while the only words exchanged were, "Fly quickly, they are upon you. Which way shall we go?" "Where you can. You are already nearly surrounded." "But what will you do?" They will kill you if they cannot catch us. We will take care of ourselves. Fly, fly, I say, instantly. These words exchanged with the quickness of thought while we were mounting and reining our horses. In another instant, we were all separated from each other, and each one was making the best shift he could for his own individual safety. I had taken about the third jump with my horse when I encountered a man rushing upon me with a rifle and taking aim at my head. He said, "You stop or I'll shoot you." He was then only a few paces from me, and others were rushing close in his rear, when I turned my horse quickly in another direction and rushed with all speed into the thickest of the forest, followed for some minutes by him and his dog, but I soon found myself alone, while I could only hear the sound of distant voices, the rushing of horsemen in every direction, with the barking of dogs. What had become of my companions or our friends, I knew not. I rode on at full speed for a while or more, when the woods terminated and no alternative was left for me but to go either to the right or to the left into one of the public highways, where I would be every moment exposed to my pursuers, or go over the fence and pass through the open fields to the wilderness beyond it. On the other hand, to turn back into the heart of the forest, partly toward the town and prisons from whence I had escaped. As horses' feet and men's voices were already heard along the highways that lay on each side of me, I determined upon the latter. I therefore changed my course, took my back track, and plunged into the depth of the forest. I then dismounted, tied my horse in a thicket, walked some distance from him, and climbed a tree, intending to wait in this situation amid the concealment of the thick foliage till the darkness of evening would enable me to proceed with safety. Seating myself on one of its forked branches and placing my arms into other similar forks, I was supported from falling. Although, in a moment after I had eased my exertion, I fainted away. In this situation, I remained for some time, without the least power to change my position or help myself. My breath was gone through overexertion, and my mouth and throat parched with a bursting thirst. My stomach sickened, and as I began to breathe, I was seized with vomiting, and threw up nearly all the food which my stomach contained. I then gradually recovered my strength till I could speak, when I began to call on the Lord, saying, "O Lord, strengthen me this once, deliver me from my persecutors, and bring me in safety to a land of liberty. And I will praise thy name, and give thee all the glory, and the remnant of my days shall be wholly devoted to thy service. For surely my life is now at stake, and if preserved, it is thy gift. Therefore I shall owe it all to thee." The darkness of evening was now fast setting in, and every moment seemed to increase my safety and security from immediate discovery, although I could still hear the distant sound of tramping horses and the voice of men and dogs in pursuit, and sometimes so near that I could distinguish some of their voices. It was a dark and moonless evening. The sky was only light by the glimmering of a few stars partly obscured by the clouds, and the thick foliage of the forest increased the gloom and served to render the darkness nearly complete. I now came down from the tree and felt my way to the place where I had tied my horse. But as good or ill luck would have it, he had loosed himself and gone, leaving me to my fate. I then groped my way amid the dark shades of the forest to a small stream of warm, muddy water, and stooping down, partly quenched my thirst. I then made my way to the highway and commenced my journey on foot, carefully watching on either hand lest I should be surprised and taken. I was an entire stranger to the country, having no guide but the polar star. My road lay nearly northward and upwards of 100 miles of wild country. People only my enemies, peopled only by enemies, still lay between me and a state where the principles of freedom yet prevailed in a sufficient degree to ensure my safety. If I could make my way through this wilderness of enemies on foot, after the weakness and debility caused by 8 months' confinement, and after the fatigue of my evening's race, and neither inquire the way nor make my appearance at any house for entertainment and refreshment, then I should still have the great Mississippi River to ferry over, and be liable to be discovered and taken in the act, while in sight of liberty. The thought of these dangers, the anxious inquiries of my mind as to what had become of my fellow prisoners and friends, which I had no means of satisfying, and the hopes and expectations of soon meeting my family and friends in a land of liberty, alternately occupied my mind as I slowly pursued my solitary way during that dark and, to me, eventful night. Chapter 33. At length the morning began to dawn, but it proved to be a cloudy day. No mark was left in the heavens to determine the point of compass, while at the same time my road became every moment more obscure, and finally terminated in a deer path which wound along among the hills and vales of a dense and entirely unsettled forest, and finally disappeared. It was now broad day. The wild forest extended around far and wide, and no sign of human existence or occupation. I still wandered slowly on, not knowing whether I was every moment traveling nearer to friends and home and liberty, or to the place of dreary confinement. The deer and wild turkey occasionally started up before me, and the howl of the wolf was heard in the distance. At length I came to a beautiful clear stream, which seemed to wind through a fine valley. The wild flowers, blooming in rich variety, sent forth sweet odors, and the birds of the forest were pouring forth in profusion their morning songs. I now sat down in safety, and took from my pocket a small biscuit that Sister Phelps had kindly provided, and which was my only store of food for the journey. With a hearty drink from the crystal stream and my biscuit, I made my first breakfast, after my imprisonment, as a free son of Columbia. I recollect that while I sat enjoying this solitary meal, far from friends and home, surrounded with a scenery strange and wild, and without any guide or any knowledge where I should claim the next refreshment, I thought of the sweets of liberty I now enjoyed, and with a thankful and joyous heart, I exclaimed aloud, "Thank God for this hour. It is the happiest of my life. I am free, although lost in the wilderness, and if I cannot find myself, thank God nobody else can find me." In this happy valley, the reader may leave me to rest a while, if he chooses, while he looks after the fate of the other prisoners and our 2 friends, and also Mrs. Phelps and the affairs of the prison, bearing in mind, at the same time, that he must return again and accompany me through the whole dangers, toils, and incidents of my journey to a land of liberty. At the time we were separated in the heat of the pursuit, Mr. Phelps made his escape much in the same manner as myself. He was at first closely pursued, but at length he outdistanced them all, and once out of their sight, he struck directly into the road and rode on toward Illinois. He had proceeded a few miles on his way when he was suddenly surrounded in the darkness of the night by a company of horsemen who were out in pursuit of the prisoners. They immediately hailed him and cried out, "Say, stranger, what is your name?" He replied in the same rough and careless manner, You rascals, what is yours?" On finding he could swear as well as themselves, they concluded he could not be a Mormon, while his bold and fearless manner convinced them that he was not a man who was fleeing for his life. They then begged his pardon for the rough manner in which they had accosted him. "Oh, you are one of the real breed. You're not a Mormon. No beepity-beep Mormon could counterfeit that language. You swear real natural. Hurrah for old Kentuck. But where might you live, stranger?" He replied, "Just up here. You might know me, and then again you might not. I think I've seen you all a heap of times, but I've been so drunk at the 4th of Independence, I hardly know myself or anybody else. But hurrah for old Kentuck. And what about those Mormons?" "What about 'em? You'd a knowed that without askin' if you'd a seen 'em run." "What? They are not out of prison, are they?" "Out of prison? Yes. The rascals raised a flag of liberty in open day and burst out, and downstairs right in the midst of the public celebration, out wrestling the jailer and outrunning the whole town in a fair foot race. They reached the timber just as they were overtaken, but before we could catch 'em, they mounted their horses. The way they cleared was a caution to cock it. We took one of them and seen the other two a few feet distant, rushin' their horses at full speed, but we couldn't catch 'em, nor shoot 'em either. I raised my new Kentucky rifle, fresh loaded and primed with a good percussion, and taking fair aim at one of their heads only a few yards distant, I fired. But the cap burst and the powder wouldn't burn." "Well, now, stranger, that's mighty big story and seems most impossible. Did you say you catched one of them? Why, I'd have thought you killed him on the spot. What have you done with him?" "They took him back to prison, I suppose. But it was only the old one. If it had been one of them other chaps, we would have skinned him as quick as Crockett would a coon, and then eaten them alive without leaving a grease spot." This interview over, the horsemen withdrew and left Phelps to pursue his way in peace. He rode on during the night without further molestation, but when day appeared he found himself in rather an awful fix, for a traveler, having lost his hat in the race the preceding day, he was, therefore, bareheaded Besides, his face was somewhat bruised and scratched in the scuffle. However, he concluded to make the best of it and trust to Providence for the issue. Riding up to a farmhouse to call for breakfast and to have his horse fed, he began to banter the host to sell him an old straw hat. "For," said he, "I got such a power of drink last evening at the big doings that I couldn't ride straight, and tumbled off my horse once or twice, and finally lost my hat." Judging from his manner and the dirt and scratches on his face, they readily believed his tale and furnished him with an old, wide-brimmed, miserable-looking hat, which served as a very good disguise during the remainder of his journey. Himself and horse refreshed, he renewed his journey and finally arrived in Illinois in safety, having reached the ferry before his pursuers and before the news of the escape had spread so far. By his arrival, the news soon spread far and wide that we had made our escape from prison and that we might be looked for soon. This news was received with a general joy and produced a lively sensation, not only throughout the society, but among the public generally, for all parties had looked upon us as martyrs, doomed to suffer the vengeance of a set of bloodthirsty outlaws and murderers. My brother Orson Pratt and the young Mr. Clark, who furnished us with the horses, must now be looked after. When we parted in the thicket, as has been before described, they had only time to flee a few paces when they found themselves completely surrounded on every hand, and no possibility left them of escape by running. They therefore dropped down into a small ravine which had been made by the water during some former freshet, and there lay as close to the earth as a young quail when its nest is disturbed. The enemy passed close by them a number of times, and so very near that they dared not make the least motion, not even to look up to see whether they were discovered. At length night came on, the pursuers retired, and they arose and pursued their journey on foot, and arrived safely in Illinois soon after the arrival of Mr. Phelps. My brother immediately repaired to the residence of my wife and children, who were waiting his return in anxious suspense, in hopes to hear some news from me, whom they considered still in prison, not having as yet heard any news of the escape. As he entered the door, Mrs. Pratt raised her anxious and sorrowful eyes and eagerly inquired, "Have you seen my husband?" "I have. Is he yet alive?" "Yes." "Is he well?" "He is." "Oh, thank God for that. Is there any prospect that he will ever get free and return alive?" "Well, I hope so, for the last time I saw him, he was astride a horse in the woods and headed toward home on a gallop." I shall not attempt to describe her feelings at that moment, as the reader can best imagine them, but suffice it to say, after her first transports were over, he sat down and related to her the whole affair which had transpired up to the time he last saw me. She was now full of hope and expectation, although mingled with fear and anxiety indescribable. If I eluded the pursuit of my enemies and arrived in safety, it was now time to look for my arrival. But if, on the other hand, I was taken back and chained down in a dungeon, or if I was shot down and left without a burial to be a prey to wolves and turkey buzzards, oh, dreadful thought! Oh, horrible suspense! Oh, the hope, joy, sorrow, anguish, misery, happiness, frenzy, and feelings undefined, which agitate and distract the bosom of a wife and mother at such a moment. If man, hard-hearted, unfeeling man, could read the heart of a woman on such an occasion, he would never more drive, imprison, or kill his fellow man. She soon set about preparing for the reception of her husband, in case he should arrive faint and exhausted with hunger and fatigue. The table was spread, and food placed upon it. The house was illuminated with through the night, during which her anxious and beating heart would not suffer her for one moment to sleep. She watched during the entire night, and on several occasions opened the door and looked abroad. But still the morning dawned, and he came not. Surely, thought she, he is slain or again confined in a dungeon, loaded with chains and kept for a sure prey to glut the vengeance of a furious mob that has been disappointed of the rest of its victims. The excitement now became general. Friends crowded in to inquire the news and to sympathize with her, and to endeavor, if possible, to keep up her hopes. They argued that the same God who had delivered him from prison and strengthened him in the chase, and the same God who prevented the powder from taking fire when the deadly rifle was aimed at him, would also stand by him and bring him safely to his friends and home. This, in some measure, still kept her spirits from sinking in despair. Armed men were now dispatched in various directions along the river and into Missouri to endeavor, if possible, to meet with him and protect him home. Another day and night at length passed away in the same suspense, no tidings having been heard from him or from any of those who had gone in search. The pursuers, however, were known to be in a ferry on the other side of the river, watching. The pursuers, however, were known to be at the ferry on the other side of the river, watching his arrival. The same precaution was taken by them at all the public ferries for some distance up and down the river. The suspense and anguish of her aching bosom now became intolerable. In vain they continued to assure her that he would be preserved and return in safety. She could plainly see that, while they sought to comfort her with hope, they themselves were half in doubt and beginning to despair of his deliverance. Another long day passed, and another night set in, and still no news, except that the ferries on the Missouri side were all strictly guarded, and the entire people on the lookout to take him dead or alive. She had now kept her table spread both day and night, and had watched for 3 entire nights without sleep. "He cannot be alive and free," exclaimed she, "or I know he would fly to meet the fond welcome of his wife and children, and relieve their aching hearts." We must now return with our readers to the prison at Columbia and take a glance at the scene that followed our departure, and learn the fate of Mr. Follett and Mrs. Phelps. As soon as the prisoners had cleared from the jailer and were fairly under way, Mrs. Phelps, who was still an inmate of the dwelling, became the particular object of their spite and rage. The old jailer and his wife commenced to rail and curse her as the author of all the mischief. They threatened her with instant death and finally turned her out of doors in the dusk of the evening and in the midst of a mob who had gathered in great numbers around the prison and raging like so many tigers disappointed of their prey. Being a stranger and without money, friends, or acquaintances in the place, she knew not where to go or what to do. She finally sat down in the open air in the midst of the mob. By whom she was assailed, cursed and insulted, threatened and abused in the most unfeeling manner for some time. But she still remained on the spot, scarcely noticed the slaying and abuse of the raging rabble. So intent was she upon the issue of the race, not knowing from one moment to the other whether her husband would be shot down or whether he would be taken and brought back in triumph. At length, after a watchful glance toward the wilderness, she heard the shout of triumph amidst the host of the enemy. And next was re-echoed from crowd to crowd, amid volleys of oaths, curses, and exulting laughs. "We've catched one of those Mormons, and we'll roast him alive over a slow fire." They now rallied around her in great numbers, exulting and threatening and boasting that they had taken her husband and would kill him on the spot. While they were thus abusing her, she saw another crowd coming and a prisoner in the midst, on whom they were venting their rage as if he would be torn to pieces. As they approached nearer, it proved to be Mr. Follett, on Mrs. Phelps' horse and side saddle. He had been surrounded, overpowered, and taken at the time we were each separated from the other. He was finally rescued from the mob and thrust alive into the lower dungeon and chained down to the floor. He remained in this doleful situation for a few days, till the wrath of the multitude had time to cool a little, and then he was unchained by the sheriff and again brought into the upper apartment and treated with some degree of kindness. They now laughed with him about his adventure, praised him for his bravery, and called him a good fellow. The truth of the matter was, they had no great desire to take the lives of any but those whom they had considered leaders, and since they had discovered that Mr. Follett and Mr. Phelps were not considered religious leaders among our society, they were in no great danger, except they should happen to be killed in the heat of excitement or passion. We now leave him in his lonesome prison with no other society than the old apostate Lumen and his dear Phila, while we get Sister Phelps out of the trouble she was in. After the fate of the prisoners seemed determined, she sank down exhausted on a block of wood in the open air, amid the surrounding darkness. Here she was still mocked and insulted by the unfeeling rabble, till a certain young man, more feeling than the others, declared that he was not accustomed to see a female treated thus in America, and that if she had no home, his father and mother would receive her kindly and give her protection under their roof till she could return to Illinois. He then went home, and in a few minutes returned with his mother, by whom she was kindly invited to their dwelling. On arriving there, she was treated in the kindest manner for about 2 weeks, during which time her horse was kept from her and ridden in search of the prisoners. They finally restored her horse and saddle to her, and she rode home in peace, where she eventually met her husband and rejoiced that she had been, in some measure, the means of his deliverance. And here I might as well inform you, the anxious reader, of the final liberation of the 2 remaining prisoners. Mr. Follett remained in confinement for several months and finally was dismissed and sent home to Illinois, where he met his family, who had been expelled from the state of Missouri in common with others during his confinement. And last of all, the old apostate came out by fair acquittal. And should any of our readers have the curiosity to see the charming couple whose singular courtship and history run through and make a principal thread in our narrative, they will call at the little town of Augusta, a few miles from Fort Madison, Iowa Territory, and inquire for Lumen and Phila, who were living there in quiet at the last accounts. Chapter 34. I suppose by this time the reader has either forgotten the circumstances in which he took leave of me, or else is somewhat weary with the winding of the narrative and impatient for it to come to a close. The only apology I have to offer for the many digressions and wanderings through which he has been led is that I consider it impolite and disrespectful to get myself out of a bad place until I have first seen my friends all safely out. Truly, I did not strictly observe this rule of good breeding in the escape itself. Therefore, it becomes to me to take the more care to observe it now, when there is no danger, expecting that a being deserted by some, accepting that of being deserted by some of my readers before I am safely out. However, if you still wish to accompany me in all the windings of my wearisome and dangerous adventure, we will now turn to the happy valley where you recollect leaving me on the morning of the 5th of July in the act of breakfasting on a small biscuit while, to all appearances, I was lost to myself and to all mankind. After resting a few minutes, I arose and traveled onward without any way to determine the course I was traveling. After some miles, I came to a house in the woods and ventured to inquire of the woman the way to Columbia, and what course it lay from there. By this means I learned that I was 14 miles distant from the prison in a northerly direction. I then took a course directly opposite to her directions, and soon found myself among settlements and in a kind of road, but very indirect and winding among fields and woods, or, in the language of that country, among clarins and timber. I paid but little respect to the road, but rather wandered around among the forests and made my course as well I could without being seen. At last the clouds thickened and it began to rain. In the meantime, I had again plunged into the depths of an unknown forest and lost all idea of the true point of the compass. The air now became dense with thick clouds and mist, and the rain was pouring in torrents. At first, I thought that rather than expose myself by any inquiry, I would sit down at the bottom of a large oak and wait patiently for the clouds to break away, so that I could see the sun and thus determine my course as to travel in uncertainty without exhausting as to travel in uncertainty would exhaust my strength for naught. I accordingly sat down, but after waiting for a long time, I found there was no prospect of seeing the sun, moon, or stars for some days to come. In the meantime, I was becoming wet and cold, lame and stiff-jointed from the effects of my exertions the night previous. I was also aware that hunger would soon be preying upon me, as I already felt very much in need of refreshment. I therefore arose and wandered on till I saw another house in the distance. I there ventured another inquiry, but by which I was enabled to make my way through the windings of the forest and finally to enter upon a vast prairie or untimbered plain without inhabitants. Through this plain, there was a direct road to a place called Paris, which was now some 20 miles distant and directly on my way. Here I could travel in solitude and have no difficulty in finding my way either by night or day, and should I chance to meet a traveler in pursuit, I could see him for some miles distant in the daytime and have time to leave the road and hide myself in the grass before he could near me. It was now drawing toward evening, and the rain was still pouring in torrents, while the wind blew almost to a tempest. I was weary and exhausted with fatigue and hunger, and chilled and benumbed with the rain and wind which had drenched me for some hours. It had been my intention to travel through the night, but I now saw it was impossible. I would be obliged to rest my weary limbs somewhere, and to sit or lie down without shelter in such a tempest. And benumbed as I then was, would be death. I would be obliged to rest my weary limbs somewhere, and to sit or lie down without shelter in such a tempest, and benumbed as I then was, would be death, or at least it would be what I could not endure. And to lodge at any house would expose me to be discovered and taken by my pursuers. As night approached, I hesitated for some time whether to continue to brave the tempest and to pass the night in the rain, or to run the risk of being taken by turning off the road and going a mile or two through the wet grass to a settlement which was in sight in the borders of the wilderness on the left of my road. At last I was compelled by the severity of the storm to choose the latter. I accordingly made for a house, but how was I to account for being a traveler and on foot, as nearly all men in that country traveled on horseback? However, my ingenuity soon prepared me a way to account for this suspicious circumstance. As I drew near the house the owner stood in the door, looking out upon the tempest and watching my approach, it being rather strange to see a person from the open plain amid such a tempest. As I drew near, all wet and dripping, I cried out very sociably, saying, "Sir, can you entertain a drowning man here this terrible night?" The answer was, "I reckon we might. Come in, stranger. You seem in a mighty bad fix." I hobbled in as well as I could, being very lame with walking, as well as benumbed with the storm, and without giving time for any more inquiry, I began to complain of the fatigue of walking and how it had lamed me, at the same time observing that my horse had played a very bad trick with me. He had gotten away from me and strayed into the timber where I could not find him. "Ah," said he, "how did you happen to lose him?" "Why," said I am from Indiana, and have been out in your wild woods back here looking for land. I had been in the habit of letting my horse bait a little occasionally, as he never seemed inclined to leave, till last evening. He of a sudden wandered out of my sight in the woods, and dark came on. I could not track him, and finally lost him. And what is worse, he carried off my clothing and all the fixings I had with me, even to my shooting irons and ammunition. I shall now have to go clear to Paris on foot, and then remain there a few days till I can advertise him and obtain him again." "Oh," exclaimed he, "it's a pity you should have such a heap of trouble. Where did you stay last night?" I replied, "The devil himself could hardly answer that. For in hunting my horse I got benighted and lost myself instead of finding him. However, I made my way out to the first cottage I could find, and took up with very curious fare, I assure you." "What part of Indiana are you from?" he continued. "From near Terre Haute," replied I. "What is the price of land in that country now?" he inquired. I replied that it had risen very much since the completion of the great national road. "Indeed," said I, "as a specimen of the rise of property, I could now take $25 per acre for my little place in the backwoods, which a few years ago only cost me $3.75. So I thought I would just mount my nag and ride west here and take a look in Illinois and Missouri, and if I could suit myself, I would go home, sell out, and come out here and purchase." "Well," said he, "I reckon you must do a heap better here than there, as we've a smart chance of land here that's very cheap. Besides," continued he, "we can make corn here so easy, and then, again, there's a power of range for cattle and horses." In this kind of conversation, the evening passed off very sociably. After eating a hearty supper, I retired to bed. In the morning I awoke much refreshed and found the storm had subsided and the sun shining in his strength. I tarried to breakfast, which consisted of a good cup of coffee and a fowl with some cornbread or dodger. After breakfast, I vented my spite once more with angry and impatient words about my poor horse, grumbled sorely at being so lame, and regretted very much to have to go on foot all the way to Paris. "And," said I get so hungry and faint in walking over these lonesome plains, where the houses are a dozen miles apart. I believe, with your leave, I'll just pocket the remainder of the dodger and chicken." "Oh, yes," said the good man, "take it and welcome. You might want it, and then again you might not. And although it's coarse fare, yet we've seen a heap of times in this new country that we couldn't get as good." I thanked her. And then settled my bill with her husband, and making her a present of $0.25, I took leave and soon found my way back to the road I had left the evening before. On arriving at the road, I found a fresh horse track had been made since the rain, and immediately concluded one of my pursuers had passed in pursuit, which I afterward learned to be the fact. I would here remark that some persons will perhaps be disposed to censure me for saying that which was not strictly true in all its points, in order to avoid discovery and make good my escape. But I can say, from the bottom of my heart, that I feel perfectly justified in so doing, not only because it accomplished a good object and seemed according to wisdom, but we have numerous instances in Scripture where God's prophets and people acted in a similar way for a similar end. For instance, the New Testament justifies Rahab and even commends her and includes her in the sum of the faithful because she hid the spies under the flax and deceived their pursuers by stating that they had left the city and fled to the mountains. Thus she became an accomplice, or aider, or an aider and abettor of the people and purposes of God. David also, who was the Lord's anointed and a man after his own heart, dissembled a number of timbers to save his life. Dissembled a number of times to save his life. At one time he deceived the national priest and thus obtained both bread and armor under pretense of being on the king's errand, while he was in fact an outlaw, then in the act of fleeing for his life from that same Saul. And Jesus himself mentions this to the Jews and justifies it. At another time, he feigned himself insane by figuring on the wall and letting his spittle drizzle down on his beard in order to escape the Philistine judges. "Oh yes," says one, "but he was the Lord's anointed and therefore had a right to save his life at all hazards to fulfill God's purposes." To this I reply that I am also God's anointed and have a greater reason for living and a more worthy object to accomplish than he did. "That may be," says the objector, "but who believes it?" I answer, 100 people believe me in the days of my trouble and humility, where one believed David. And well they might, for I have a greater work to accomplish than he ever did. But the world may blame unjustly. I care not a straw for their judgment. I have one only that I serve, and him only do I fear. The hypocrite who censures me may yet be placed under similar circumstances, and then judge ye how he would act. But to drop the argument and resume the history, I now pursue my way until I entered upon a public road called the Louisiana Road, as it was connected with the ferry on the Mississippi at a place called by that name. I had traveled that road before, and I was not a little rejoiced to find myself on ground I was so well acquainted with that I could travel by night without any danger of missing my way. I was now in a part of the state that was comparatively densely inhabited, and therefore considered too unsafe to proceed in the daytime. As the news of our escape must by this time have spread far and wide, I therefore spent the day either in concealment among the thickets, or in slowly progressing on my journey with much caution and many deviations from the road, in order to shun plantations and houses. But at night I pursued my way with all the strength I had. On the 3rd or 4th day after my escape from prison, I found myself in the neighborhood of a settlement where I had formed some acquaintances years before, and where once lived a small branch of the church. But they had all moved west, and I supposed were driven out of the state with the others. But I recollected a family by the name of Ivy, who would still be living on the road, and who had been members but were now dissenters. I was now very hungry and wanted a friend, but was in doubt whether they would befriend or betray me, as they had once been my friends, and not only so, but their near kindred had suffered in the general persecution, and had shared the common banishment. I hesitated, prayed at length, came to the conclusion that I would venture past their door in open day, and if no one discovered or recognized me, I would take it as a providence and conclude it was wisdom in God, as I would not be safe with them. But if, on the other hand, I was saluted by them, then I would think it a sign which Providence had given me as a witness that I could trust to them. I accordingly walked past their dwelling on Sunday evening, about 2 hours before sundown. As I got nearly past, the little children who were playing in the front dooryard discovered me and cried out with surprise and joy, "There is Brother Pratt!" At this a young man came running out to me, who proved to be one of my acquaintances. He was still a member of the church, and who had been driven from the upper country, but instead of going to Illinois with the rest, he had come back and settled in his old neighborhood. I asked him where Mr. Ivy, the man of the house, was. He replied that he and his wife had gone to a neighbor's 2 or 3 miles distant on a visit. And, he continued, I also am here on a visit at the same time. And I am very glad, for the news has just reached here that the prisoners had escaped, and that they burst a cap at one and took another and carried him back to prison. The other 2 have not been found. This was the first news I had heard, either of myself or of others. I then requested him to go and charge the children strictly not to mention that they had seen me, and then come with me into the woods. He did so. I then told him I was very hungry, faint, and weary, and not only so, but so lame I could hardly move. Besides, my feet were blistered, skinned, and bloody. He said that his brother, who was also a member, and had been driven with him from the upper country, lived in an obscure place in the woods some 2 miles distant, and that his brother's wife and children were as true and genuine Mormons as ever lived. He then took me on his horse and conducted me through the pathless wild for 2 miles, and coming in sight of his brother's house, I dismounted and hid myself in a deep valley, where sides were nearly perpendicular and formed a craggy rock, while he went to reconnoiter the house and to get something ready for me to eat. He soon returned, informed me that his brother was out and would not be in till dark, but the family wished very much that I would come in, as the children would hold their tongues, and it was thought to be perfectly safe. I declined, however, for the present, and he brought me out some bread, milk, and cream, on which I refreshed myself till they prepared a more substantial supper. As evening came on, being pressed to come in, I finally consented. On entering, I was received with joy by the family, and sat down to supper. One of their neighbors, a young man, soon came in and seemed determined to tarry till the arrival of the man of the house, as he had some errand with him. This embarrassed me very much, for I was fearful that he would arrive and salute me as an old acquaintance, and call my name in the presence of the young man. But the little children, bless their souls, took care for the matter. They watched very narrowly for the arrival of their papa, and when they saw him, they whispered to him that Brother Pratt was there, and being just out of prison, he must not know him till Mr. Blank had gone. The man came in. I looked up with a vacant stare, or rather with a strange and distant air, and inquired if he was the man of the house. He nodded coolly in the affirmative. I then inquired of him if he had seen any stray nags in his neighborhood. I then went on to describe my horse that had strayed from me, and observed that I was out in search of him, and being weary and hungry, I had stopped to get some refreshment with him. He said I was welcome to his house, and to such fare as he had, but he had not seen any nags, except what was owned in the neighborhood. The young man soon did his errand and withdrew. We then shook each other by the hand most heartily, and with a burst of joy and smiles, inquired after each other's welfare. I told him I was well nigh exhausted and worn out, and withal, very lame, but I still had some hopes of making my escape out of the state, and of living to see my friends once more in a land of liberty. I then begged of him to exchange with me, and take my fur cap and give me a hat in its stead, which he did, and then saddled his horse with a side saddle, as the young man who was in had just borrowed the other saddle, and placed me on horseback. He ran before me and by my side on foot to take me on my journey. In this way we traveled till 12 o'clock at night, when I dismounted, and he bid me farewell, in order to reach his home again before the neighbors would arise and find him missing. He had given me directions which would lead to the Mississippi River, much nearer than the Louisiana ferry, and also more in the direct course toward my family, who resided in Quincy. Besides all these advantages, the route was more obscure and therefore safer for me. I now pursued my course the remainder of the night with renewed courage and strength, although so very lame, footsore, and so much exhausted that, in lying down to refresh myself, I could not again rise and put myself in motion short of extraordinary and repeated exertion, sometimes having to crawl on my hands and knees till I could get sufficiently limbered to arise and walk, and frequently staggering and falling in the attempt. At length the day began to dawn, and I must soon be under the necessity of hiding in the thickets or making deviations from the road, in order to avoid discovery in passing the settlements. I therefore wished to push my way with all speed while it was yet too early for people to be stirring. But sleep now completely overpowered me. As I was walking along the road, I could scarcely open my eyes for a moment to look my way for a few rods ahead, and they would then close and sleep in spite of my powers. I would then proceed a few paces in my sleep till I stumbled, or till I had need to take another look at the road before me. Then I would open my eyes and take one glance, and the lids would fall again, as powerless as if I had no life. In this way I walked on, alternately sleeping and walking, till I presume I had more than 50 naps without ceasing to walk, and each time I opened my eyes and came to my senses, I firmly resolved to keep them open and run no further risk. But while this resolution was still passing in my mind, sleep would again steal over me, not exactly unawares, for I realized each time, but had no power to prevent it. At length the twilight gave place to the full blaze of the morning, and the sons of the earth were again in motion. I therefore retired, like the owl, to the thicket, and took a morning rest. When I awoke, the sun was high in the heavens, and feeling somewhat refreshed, I rose from the ground and wandered slow and solitary amid the wilds of oak interspersed with hazel and underwood, sometimes stopping to pick and eat a few unripe blackberries, and sometimes resting beneath the shade of a spreading tree. I had now great hopes of having to pass but one more night in the land of enemies, as I could easily reach a small town in the course of the day, which was then only 2 or 3 miles distant, and then I could by any means get on to the right track before night. I would only have about 8 or 10 miles travel for the whole night, which would bring me to a small town on the Mississippi. I wandered on amid the wilds, but at length about half a mile of open plain or prairie intervened between me and the town. To pass this in a public road in open day would be running a great venture, and to wait for the cover of darkness would perhaps keep me wandering another night. For the want of being started in the right road from the town before me to the landing on the river, I therefore concluded to venture across the plain, along the public way, in the daytime, and should I be discovered, I would sell my life as dear as possible sooner than be taken back to prison. I therefore walked boldly on. I had proceeded about to the middle of the plain when, on a sudden turn of the road, 2 men appeared on horseback, each with a rifle on his shoulder. They were then too near for me to retreat or to make any other shift than to meet them. As soon as they discovered me, they both halted as if surprised, and one said to the other, "There he is now." Then they rode on toward me, and I expected every moment that they would hail and attempt to stop me. In such a case I felt determined to seize one of their rifles and overpower or frighten them, or die in the struggle. I at length passed between them in the middle of the road, and looked as calm and unconcerned as if I hardly knew they were there. Either from their circumstance or some other unaccountable to me, they never spoke to me at all, but rode on, and I saw them no more. I soon passed the plain and made my way into a small thicket of trees that lay adjoining the little town. I then crept up near the courthouse, which occupied a public square in the center, and endeavored, without being discovered or noticed by any person, to ascertain as well as I could by my own judgment which of all the roads would seem to lead off toward the river. After reconnoitering the town and the various bearings of the roads, I retreated back into the wilderness with the satisfaction that I had not yet been discovered by the citizens. I had also the satisfaction of seeing the highlands and the hills, broken country, which evidently bordered on the Mississippi. The river, therefore, could be but a few miles distant, and as it was yet several hours to sundown, I concluded that I could take my course and without any particular regard to roads, reach some spot on the river that evening, and nothing was to be so much dreaded as a public ferry, for there I knew the enemy would set their traps. I immediately took my course, and after wandering for an hour or two with great fatigue among thickets of brush, briars, and vines, almost impassable, I at length descended a steep decline of perhaps 200 feet, and then came down to what is called in the country the river bottom, covered with the growth of thick forest, and appearing in some places somewhat swampy and gloomy. But still I pushed on, and with all speed, supposing I was not many miles from the river Mississippi. After traveling for some distance in this disagreeable and swampy wild, what was my surprise and disappointment when on a sudden I came to a dark, deep and muddy-looking river, some 50 rods wide and rolling with a swift and turbulent current. This surely could not be the Mississippi, and yet it was something that intervened between me and that great river, and seemed to present an impassable barrier. I then heaved a deep sigh, and feeling exhausted and almost discouraged, I exclaimed to myself half aloud, "How long shall I wander and find no rest? It does seem as though an enchanted ground lay between me and liberty." I turned round, and with the little strength that then remained, I made my way back to the town. When I arrived again in sight of the town, the sun was setting, and another wearisome night was approaching, in which I must reach the river, or would probably be exhausted with hunger and fatigue, so as to be entirely disabled. In which I must reach the river, or I would probably be exhausted with hunger and fatigue, so as to be entirely disabled. I now resolved to venture boldly into a public highway, to ascertain the right road before it would be too dark to find my way or choose my course. There would not only be danger of exposure by inquiring, but although I knew there was a little town on the Mississippi near the place I was then in, yet I had never heard the name of it, and to appear like a stranger who did not know the country, and yet be on foot and without a parcel or valise or anything which travelers are accustomed to carry, and with all a beard nearly a week old, together with sweat and dirt over my clothes from lying and tumbling on the ground, would altogether make me seem like a very suspicious character. But yet I must venture an inquiry, which I determined to do the first providential opportunity which occurred. I walked along the edge of the town and struck into a public highway that seemed to lead the right course. I had not traveled far when I came to a branch of the same river that I had encountered in the swampy bottom on one side of the road. On one side of the road a mill was situated on its bank, and on the other side a dwelling house. Several persons were about the mill, and it was not yet dark. I was now determined to pass by boldly, and if anyone passed near me, to speak to them and inquire the way, and then pass on so quickly that they would have no time to have suspicion or to question me. Just as I was passing between the house and the mill, I said, "Good evening, sir. How do you cross the river?" He replied that the teams and horsemen ford it, but a footman, by chance, to cross it on the mill down yonder. Said I, "Is this the right road to what the plague is it you call that little town yonder, your nearest landing on the river? What is its name? I can seldom think of it." "Oh, Saverton," he replied. "Oh, yes, Saverton," I repeated. "Yes," said he, "this is the direct road to it." I replied, "Thank you, sir. How far is it?" 9 miles, said he. By this time, I was some distance past him, and in another moment I was balancing my clumsy and worn-out body on the edge of the dam, while the waters were roaring and foaming beneath me. I got safely over and now pursued my way with increasing hope and certainty. However, I had not gone to exceed half a mile before I came to another fork in the river, larger and swifter than the one I had just crossed, and withal neither dam nor bridge. I soon forded boldly into it, determined either to sink, swim, or ford it. It proved to be about a yard deep, with a strong current, and several yards wide, but I forded it in safety and still pursued my way. After wandering for a mile or two along the bottom lands, I ascended a high bluff of several 100 feet, and thus entered upon the high, rocky, unsettled wilds that intervened between the bed of the river and the great Mississippi. It was now dark, and I was fairly under way of my night's journey, which at most could not exceed 7 or 8 miles, and feeling extremely exhausted and also at leisure, I stepped aside from the road and laid me down at the foot of a tree with a block of wood for a pillow, where I intended to sleep for an hour or two. It was a wild scene in which to slumber. No human abode was near. No voice or sound stole upon the stillness of the evening. The stars shone forth in unwonted splendor in the heavens, while wild and grassy hills and rocky steeps pierced with deep vales. The chasms extended far and wide on all sides, as if reposing in eternal undisturbed quiet and loneliness. "Ah," thought I, as I lay in silent meditation and contemplated the scene, "here is peace, here is rest, here is solitude of grand and sacred repose, scarcely polluted by the bloodthirsty dwellers upon the degraded earth, and were it not for the ties of wife, children, and duties which bind me to society, how gladly I would seek a lone cavern of some unknown retreat amid these romantic wilds, and never more feel the ills and suffer the evils which now distract and disturb the peace of a poor, miserable world." As I had finished these meditations and was about to fall asleep, I turned to my side and made a slight movement in adjusting my wooden pillow, when I realized the well-known rattle of a rattlesnake close by my side. As if disturbed in his repose, or as if I had more than my portion of the bed. I then recollected the old proverb that traveling makes strange bedfellows, and also the scripture which says, if two lie together, there is heat. But how can one be warm alone? Said I, old friend, I'll not argue with you as my first mother did with your venerable ancestor. And rather than quarrel or keep you awake, we will part. With this, I arose. And very condescendingly sought out another bed, where I was so fortunate as to remain in undisturbed possession till the chill of the night air admonished me to be again on the move. I then arose, and after much exertion, became at length able to use my limbs, and thus continued my journey. Early dawn found me standing on a height that overlooks the little village of Severton and a broad road, which was the only barrier between me and safety from my enemies. As the rays of the morning began to expand with increasing light, the dark outlines of the wooded bottoms of Illinois were distinctly visible. I had now seen with my eyes the land of peace, and a land that contained family, friends, and all that was dear to me. But oh, if I should be intercepted at the ferry, and thus lose at once my labor and my hope. I now knelt down and prayed fervently to God for deliverance, and thanked him for the past and for his mercy and providence which had preserved me thus far. I then descended from the height and entered the town, the people yet being wrapped in repose. I examined the shore, soon convinced myself that no public ferry was kept there. I was extremely glad to learn this fact, being fully aware that by this time all the ferries would be watched. I next tried to find some road or path up the river bank, so as to pass along and obtain the use of some chance canoe. But this was impossible. Huge rocks and mountainous steeps, with alternate ditches or patches of mire, rendered it impossible, even for a footman, to pass up the bank of the river. I then made my way down along the steady beach that lay between the towns, and just as the people were beginning to stir, I left the town and continued down along the river for some 5 miles, sometimes climbing steep and rocky spires of the bluffs and sometimes wading through mire and marsh. At length, I came to a dwelling on the banks of the river and saw several canoes lying in the water before it. I entered the house and inquired of the lady whether I could get a passage over the river in a canoe. She replied that her husband sometimes set people across, but owing to the swift current and a large island several miles in length, which lay in the middle of the river, it was a tedious job, for which he never charged less than $1. But, however, he was very busy in the harvest field, about a mile distant, and owing to the hurry of the harvest, he did not think he could be prevailed on to do it at any price. I was now ready to faint from extreme heat and exertion and hunger, and to walk another mile and back upon and uncertainty was altogether out of the question, to say nothing of the danger of the exposure to which it would subject me. I cast my eyes toward the canoes, and they looked very tempting, and I know not, but I might have been tempted to charter one without the leave of the owner. But just then I saw a boy of 10 or 12 years of age playing about the water. I asked him if he was accustomed to paddling a canoe. He replied yes. I then offered him a good price if he would set me across the river. He refused to do this, saying that his parents would whip him for so doing. But, said he, I will set you over on to yon big island, which is 1 mile from here, and you can then walk a mile or 2 through the woods and come to the opposite shore of it, and then shout and make signs to the people on the Illinois shore, who will come across their half of the river and take you from the island. He observed that people had often crossed over in this way. I hardly believed him, but still I thought an uninhabited island was preferable to staying another minute in Missouri. The boy soon set me over and left me on the shore of the island, pointing out my course as well as he could. I paid him well and then commenced my overland journey among the nettles, flies, mosquitoes, and heat. I was soon entangled in thickets of hazel, thorn, and grapevines, which made my progress very slow, as well as extremely laborious and difficult. These, however, were soon intersected with sloughs of mire and water, which could only be crossed with the utmost difficulty by picking my way on old logs and wood, and sometimes wading in mire and water. After crossing several of these, I at length came to one much larger, which I judged was navigable for a steamboat. And I now found to my inexpressible horror and disappointment, that he had deceived me. I had now no alternative left but to make my way back through the same difficulties I had just passed and to the shore where he had just left me. And then I should have no other chance but to call and make signs to the Missouri shore, which I had just left with so much joy and, as I hoped, forever. This was at length accomplished, and I had the inexpressible joy of seeing my sign answered by the same boy, who soon came paddling to me. As soon as his canoe touched the land, I bounded into it and said to him with a determined tone and manner, "You have deceived me, my boy. So now you have to go to the opposite shore. If you never went before, I will then pay you another $1, which will pay you even if your parents chasten you for going." We now headed up the current, and after a painful and laborious exertion of an hour or 2, we doubled the cape at the head of the island and shot off across the river at a rapid rate. We soon landed in the woods in the low bottom with no signs of inhabitants, although while crossing I had seen some houses on the shore a mile or 2 below. I now paid the boy his $1. He pushed off and commenced his way back exceedingly well pleased. I immediately stepped a few paces into the woods and, kneeling down, kissed the ground as a land of liberty, and then poured out my soul in thanks to God. I then arose and made my way down the river for some 2 miles through woods and swamps, and finally came to a house. I entered it, determined to call for something to eat. No one was in but a little boy, but he said his mother would be in 2 or 3 minutes. I asked him for some milk, and he gave me a vessel that was full, probably containing between 1 or 2 quarts. I intended only to taste of it to keep me from fainting, and then wait till the woman came and ask her leave to drink the remainder, as it was all she had. But once to my famishing mouth, it never ceased to decrease till it was all swallowed. I now felt somewhat abashed and mortified at what I had done, but concluded money would pay all damages. Hearing the footsteps of the woman at the door, I was fixing my mouth for an awkward apology when I heard a sudden scream. On looking up, Mrs. Sabery Ganger stood before me with both hands lifted up in an ecstasy of amazement. I said to her, "Be not afraid, handle me and see, for a spirit hath not flesh and bones as you see me have." She exclaimed, "Why, good Lord, is that you? Why, all the world is hunting you, both friends and enemies. They had almost given you up." She then flew around, scolded the child, talked to the ducks and chickens to keep out of the house and out of the garden and not stray off. She washed my feet, gave me some clean socks, got me some dinner, told me 1,000 things about our friends, asked 500 questions, laughed, cried, and again scolded the children and chickens. This over and dinner eaten, she put on her bonnet and accompanied me to her husband, who was clearing a small spot of land nearby. I had forgotten to say that this woman had been one of our nearest neighbors in Ohio for several years. Her husband now dropped his work and accompanied me as a guide for 5 miles across a wet, low, untimbered bottom, covered mostly with high grass and stagnant water, and entirely destitute of shade or refreshment of any kind. The air was now extremely sultry, and the sun poured in scorching beams, while we could get no water to drink, nor any rest or retreat for a moment. To sit down in the tall grass under these scorching rays without a breath of wind would be overwhelming. I had not proceeded more than a mile or 2 before I became so weak and faint that I could hardly speak or stand, and parched with a burning thirst. I was upon the point of lying down in the hot and stagnant water, but he took me by the arm and partly supported me and drew me along for some distance, exhorting and begging of me to try my utmost to hold up a little longer. In this way I finally reached the upland and the shade of a fence, and within about half a mile of a settlement of the saints and other citizens, which extended along the bluff. I dropped down under the shade of this fence and fainted entirely away. The man ran to the house of Brother Brown and got some cool spring water and a little camphor, and was returning with it. Sister Brown, who had never seen me, came running before him to my relief. While they were yet distant, I had partly come to, and feeling a dreadful faintness at my stomach and a raging thirst which knew no bounds, I made an effort to arise and run toward her, at the same time making signs for them to hasten. I staggered a few paces like a drunken man, and again fell to the earth. This singular appearance and my dirty clothes and long beard so frightened the woman that, instead of hurrying, she halted till the man came up with her, and then she exclaimed, It cannot be Elder Pratt, of whom I have heard so much. It must be some old drunkard. But the man assured her it was I, and they then came on together. They bathed my temples and wrists in cold water and camphor, and finally gave me a spoonful or two at a time to drink. In about half an hour, I was so far revived as to be able to arise and be led to the house. I then shaved and washed myself and borrowed a change of linen and got into a comfortable bed. Next morning, I felt quite refreshed, and after resting through the day, I was so far recruited as to be able to mount a horse at evening and ride toward Quincy, which was still 25 miles distant. Brother Brown furnished me a good horse and saddle, and himself another, and we started for Quincy in high spirits, just as the sun was setting. We rode on at a brisk rate and arrived in Quincy about 2 o'clock the next morning, riding up to the dwelling which, from the partial recollection of Mrs. Brown, as well as from the fact of my 2 Missouri cows laying before it quietly and chewing their cud, we judged was my wife's residence. We dismounted and gave a gentle knock at the door. She had watched for 4 successive nights, and most of the 5th, and had now just lain down and given up all for lost. On hearing the knock, she sprang from bed and opened the door, and in another instant I had clasped her in my arms.